Vikings should have frozen to death. No central heating, no high-tech gear, just brutal, endless winters where the sun barely rose, and yet they didn't just survive, they thrived. But here's the part no one talks about. Their secret wasn't just raw toughness or dumb luck, it was something far more insane. How did they stay warm in the Arctic cold without firewood? What bizarre foods kept them alive when nothing would grow? And why did Viking winter survival involve rotting fish, fermented sweat, and something straight out of a horror movie? Modern people wouldn't last a week in these conditions, but the Vikings, they hacked winter like it was just another battle. And once you see how they did it, you'll never think of them the same way again. The myth of the Viking winter struggle. So, here's the thing, most people have completely the wrong idea about Viking survival. When you picture a Viking in the dead of winter, you probably imagine some wild-eyed warrior shivering in a wooden hut, huddled around a tiny fire, surviving on scraps of dried meat and sheer willpower. Or maybe you think of them as these brutish, unbreakable icemen, just powering through the cold like it didn't even affect them. Both? Completely wrong. See, the mainstream idea is that Vikings barely scraped by in winter, that they were constantly on the verge of freezing or starving, and why wouldn't people think that? They lived in Scandinavia, one of the coldest and most unforgiving regions on Earth. But here's where the misconception falls apart. Vikings weren't just strong, they were smart. They didn't suffer through winter, they mastered it. They hacked the freezing temperatures with techniques so ahead of their time that even modern survivalists would be shocked. And the weirdest part? Some of their methods sound so insane that if you tried them today, people would call you a lunatic. So how did they do it? How did they survive months of darkness and cold without modern technology? And why does everything we think we know about Viking survival completely miss the mark? Well, get ready, because the truth is stranger than fiction. Title: The Viking Winter Hack That Shouldn't Have Worked on Screen Text. Chapter title. Alright, so here's where things get wild. If you dropped a modern survivalist in a Viking winter, no insulated gear, no high-tech food storage, they'd have days before hypothermia and starvation kicked in. But Vikings? They had a system so advanced, so counterintuitive, it sounds like something straight out of a post-apocalyptic movie. First up, firewood? Overrated. Most people assume Vikings just spent their winters endlessly chopping wood and tossing logs into giant hearths like something out of Game of Thrones. But here's the issue. Scandinavia's forests were not endless. Firewood was precious, and burning it 24/7, a massive waste. Instead, they had something even better: sod houses. Yeah, Vikings built their homes out of dirt, and not just any dirt, thick, grass-covered sod bricks that worked like natural insulation. These houses were basically prehistoric heat traps, designed to lock in body heat so efficiently that a single fire could warm an entire household. And if you think that's crazy, just wait, because when food became scarce, Vikings didn't just store food, they transformed it. Ever heard of hackarl? That's Viking for fermented shark, but calling it fermented is putting it nicely. In reality, it was rotting shark meat, buried underground for months until it became so toxic it could literally make you hallucinate. And yet, Vikings ate it on purpose. Why? Because it was impossible to farm in winter, so they mastered the art of rotting food in a way that made it last for months. And it wasn't just shark. They did this with fish, meat, even milk, turning it into high-fat, protein-rich survival fuel that could keep them going when everyone else would have starved. And if you're thinking, okay, but what about drinking water? Everything would have been frozen solid. Well, here's the grossest part. They drank sweat. Not literally, but they had a technique called sour whey fermentation, where they stored liquid in sealed animal skins and let it ferment into a nutrient-packed, bacteria-killing drink that kept them hydrated without freezing. Scene 2, Viking ingenuity versus. So while the rest of medieval Europe was dying in famines, Vikings were out here aging meat like fine wine, living in naturally insulated dirt bunkers and sipping on homemade electrolytes. The question isn't how Vikings survived winter, the question is, why did we stop doing it? Title: How the Vikings Outsmarted Winter Better Than Anyone Else. On screen text chapter title. At this point, we've already obliterated the idea that Vikings barely scraped through winter. But now, let's go even deeper, because their survival methods weren't just effective, they were miles ahead of what most civilizations were doing at the time. Take clothing, for example. People assume Vikings just wrapped themselves in heavy furs and called it a day, but nope, their winter gear was scientifically layered for maximum efficiency. They wore wool, not just any wool, but tightly woven, water-resistant wool cloaks that trapped body heat even when wet. And underneath that, a secret weapon called vadmal, a special type of wool fabric so dense and insulated, it was literally used as currency in trade because it was that valuable. But here's the kicker. Vikings hated sweating in the cold. Sounds weird, right? But they understood that moisture kills in freezing temperatures. So instead of stuffing themselves in thick layers, they wore breathable clothing that wicked sweat away and kept their skin dry. Meanwhile, medieval Europeans were piling on thick, heavy coats, sweating under their layers, and then freezing to death once the moisture turned to ice. Vikings, they never made that mistake. And it wasn't just clothing. Their homes were climate-controlled before climate control was even a thing. Viking longhouses had central fireplaces, earth-insulated walls, and heat-trapping wooden ceilings designed to hold warmth without making the air too dry. While castles and stone homes in Europe were freezing cold and drafty, Viking houses were warmer, more efficient, and better designed for the extreme cold. They didn't just survive winter, they lived comfortably through it. Title: Why Viking Winters Were Strategically Better Than Summer. On screen text, chapter title. Now here's the most unexpected part. For Vikings, winter wasn't just something to endure, it was actually the best time of the year. Yeah, you heard that right. While most cultures struggled in winter, Vikings used it to their advantage. Here's why. No farming meant no manual labor. Summer was when Vikings had to work the hardest, plowing, harvesting, maintaining crops. Winter, that was their off-season. While medieval peasants were freezing to death in barely heated stone houses, Vikings were indoors, resting, feasting, and getting stronger. Winter made raids easier. Rivers and lakes froze solid, which meant Viking warbands could travel directly across frozen water instead of taking long, dangerous boat routes. While their enemies were huddled in castles, Vikings could launch surprise attacks right across the ice. Enemies were weaker in winter. Most civilizations weren't built for brutal winters. Their armies slowed down, food became scarce, and morale dropped. Vikings? They thrived in the cold. They could fight, travel, and hunt in conditions that left their enemies completely helpless. For Vikings, winter wasn't an obstacle, it was an advantage. The final proof that Vikings were built different. Let's be real. If Vikings weren't absolute masters of surviving winter, their civilization would have collapsed. But instead, they expanded. They sailed to Greenland, Iceland, and even North America, places that would have killed most medieval people in months. And they did it without modern survival gear, without backup, and without outside help. They knew how to store food for years using fermentation, drying, and curing techniques that modern science is still studying. They had biological cold resistance that made them more durable than the average person today. They mastered fireless insulation, weatherproof clothing, and strategic winter warfare that made them nearly unstoppable. So the next time someone talks about how Vikings barely survived the brutal winters, you'll know the truth. They didn't just survive, they thrived. Title: The Truth About Viking Survival on Screen Text. Chapter title. So let's set the record straight. Everything you thought you knew about Viking survival, it was a lie. They weren't just tough warriors suffering through brutal winters. They were tactical masterminds who understood the cold better than any civilization of their time. They didn't rely on luck or sheer endurance to make it through months of freezing darkness. They built homes that trapped heat more efficiently than medieval castles. They developed clothing that kept them warm even when wet, something modern winter gear still struggles with. They preserved food so well that they could survive for years without fresh crops. And unlike the rest of medieval Europe, they weren't just enduring winter, they were using it as an advantage. Vikings were biologically and mentally adapted to extreme cold. Their bodies generated heat differently. Their training and lifestyle made them resistant to conditions that would shut down most modern people in hours. And instead of fearing winter, they weaponized it. Frozen rivers and lakes became highways for travel. The slowed-down, starving armies of their enemies became easy prey. The season most civilizations dreaded was, for the Vikings, a time to rest, prepare, and strike. And here's the craziest part. We've actually forgotten most of their secrets. Today, we complain about the cold, bundle up in overpriced winter gear, and crank up the heat in our homes like there's no other option. But the Vikings had already cracked the code centuries ago. They figured out how to survive, not by fighting winter but by working with it. So the next time someone says Vikings barely survived their brutal winters, just remember, they didn't just survive. They thrived, they conquered, and they left behind a blueprint that we're only now starting to understand. If you found this look into Viking survival fascinating, make sure to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe. Because trust me, history is filled with stories that completely flip what you thought you knew. And if you thought the way Vikings hacked winter was insane, wait until you hear what they did with their dead, but that's a story for another day.